This is the story of the maid hid a letter under the black millionaire's pillow. When he read it, he collapsed as it truly unfolded. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like angry fists, each drop catching the amber glow of the city lights 40 stories below. Marcus Wellington stood motionless in his study, the weight of his Armani suit feeling heavier than usual as he stared at the financial reports scattered across his mahogany desk. The numbers were good, better than good. His tech empire had just closed another billion-dollar acquisition, yet the hollow ache in his chest seemed to grow deeper with each success. At 38, Marcus had everything the world told him he should want. The penthouse overlooking Manhattan's skyline, the fleet of luxury cars, the respect that came with being one of the youngest black billionaires in America. But tonight, like so many nights before, the silence in his home felt deafening. If you've ever felt successful on paper but empty inside, you'll understand what was about to unfold in these walls. The soft knock on his study door barely registered above the storm outside. "Mr. Wellington?" The voice was gentle, careful, the same voice that had greeted him every morning for the past 3 years. "I've prepared your dinner, sir." Elena Vasquez had been his housekeeper since his divorce, a quiet woman in her 50s, whose presence had become as familiar as the expensive furniture that filled his empty rooms. She moved through his life like a shadow, efficient and invisible, the way he preferred his staff to be. What Marcus didn't know was that Elena saw everything, every lonely dinner eaten in silence, every phone call that ended in frustration, every moment when his carefully constructed facade cracked just enough to reveal the man underneath. "Just leave it in the dining room," Marcus replied without turning around. "I'll eat later." Elena hesitated in the doorway, her weathered hands clutching a silver tray. She had worked for wealthy families her entire adult life, but something about Marcus Wellington had always troubled her. Not because he was difficult, quite the opposite. He was polite, respectful, never raised his voice or made unreasonable demands. It was his loneliness that haunted her, the way he carried himself like a man who had won every battle but lost the war. "Sir, if I may," Elena said softly, "you haven't eaten properly in 3 days." Marcus finally turned, and Elena caught a glimpse of something raw in his dark eyes before he composed himself. "I appreciate your concern, Elena, but I'm fine. Just busy with the Morrison acquisition." The lie sat between them like a third person in the room. Elena had raised 4 children of her own, had buried a husband, had scraped together enough money to put her youngest daughter through nursing school by cleaning the homes of people who would never know her last name. She recognized pain when she saw it, regardless of how expensive the suit was that tried to hide it. "Of course, sir, good night." As Eleanor retreated down the marble hallway, her soft-soled shoes making no sound, she thought about the conversation she'd overheard 3 weeks ago. Marcus had been on a video call with his lawyer, discussing his will. At 55, Elena had learned that rich people often talked about money and death in the same breath, but something about that conversation had chilled her. The way Marcus had spoken about his assets, his foundation, his legacy, as if he were already gone. The next morning arrived grey and muted, the storm having passed but leaving the city wrapped in a thick blanket of clouds. Marcus emerged from his bedroom at exactly 7:30, as he had every weekday for the past 3 years. His routine was precise, almost ritualistic. Black coffee, no sugar, 2 pieces of whole-grain toast, a quick scan of the financial news, then 45 minutes in his private gym before his driver arrived. Elena watched him from the kitchen, noting the way his shoulders seemed to carry more weight each day. She had prepared his breakfast exactly as he liked it, but she knew he would only pick at the toast and leave the rest untouched. The coffee would go cold while he stared at his phone, reading emails that made his jaw tighten and his fingers drum against the granite countertop. "Elena," Marcus said as she refilled his cup, "I'll be traveling to Singapore next week for the Chen Industries meeting. I'll be gone for about 10 days. "Yes, sir. Shall I prepare anything special for your return?" Marcus paused, his cup halfway to his lips. For a moment, Elena thought he might say something real, something that acknowledged the strange intimacy of their daily interactions. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to his phone. What Elena didn't tell him was that she had already heard about the Singapore trip, not from him, but from the hushed conversation between his assistant and his lawyer that she'd accidentally overheard while dusting the hallway outside his office. They had been discussing more than just business meetings. They had been talking about Marcus's recent visits to a doctor, about test results, about decisions that needed to be made. That afternoon, while Marcus was at his office downtown, Eleanor found herself standing in his bedroom, ostensibly changing the sheets but really studying the man's private space for clues to his inner world. The room was immaculate, almost sterile in its perfection. No family photos on the nightstand, no personal mementos scattered about, nothing that spoke to relationships or memories worth keeping close. But there, on his dresser, partially hidden behind a bottle of expensive cologne, was a small framed photograph. Elena had noticed it before, but never really looked at it. Now, as afternoon light filtered through the sheer curtains, she could see it clearly. A much younger Marcus, maybe in his early 20s, standing next to an elderly black woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. They were in front of a small house with a front porch, and Marcus's arm was wrapped around the woman's shoulders. His smile in the photo was genuine, unguarded, nothing like the careful expression he wore now. Elena picked up the frame, studying the woman's face. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at a memory Elena couldn't quite place. The woman wore a simple floral dress and an apron, and her hands, visible where they rested on Marcus's arm, were the hands of someone who had worked hard her entire life. A sound from the hallway made Elena quickly replace the photograph and return to her work, but the image stayed with her for the rest of the day. That evening, as she prepared to leave for her small apartment in Queens, she made a decision that would change everything. Elena had always been a woman who believed in signs, in the small moments when the universe seemed to whisper instructions to those willing to listen. Her grandmother had taught her that sometimes the most important conversations happened not with words, but with actions, small gestures that carried the weight of entire lifetimes. That night, in her modest kitchen, Eleanor sat at her small table with a cup of tea and a piece of paper. She had never been good with words, had left school at 16 to help support her family, but she knew how to speak from the heart. The letter she began to write was not long, but every word was chosen with the care of someone who understood that truth, when finally spoken, could either heal or destroy. Over the next few days, Elena watched Marcus more carefully than ever before. She noticed how he stood at his bedroom window each morning, staring out at the city, as if searching for something he couldn't name. She saw how his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was looking, how he sometimes pressed his fingers to his chest, as if trying to calm something inside. She observed the way he spoke to his business associates on the phone, sharp, decisive, completely in control, and then how he sat in silence afterward, as if the performance had drained something essential from him. The letter grew longer each night as Elena added details, memories, observations that she had collected during their 3 years together. She wrote about the morning she had found him asleep at his desk, his face peaceful in a way she never saw when he was awake. She wrote about the time she had heard him on the phone with a children's hospital, quietly arranging for a wing to be built in someone's memory, his voice soft with grief he thought no one would notice. But most importantly, she wrote about the photograph on his dresser and the conversation she had overheard between his lawyer and his doctor. Elena had worked for enough wealthy families to recognize the signs, the sudden interest in updating wills, the medical appointments that were never mentioned, the way a person began to move through their life as if they were already saying goodbye. What would you do if you suspected someone was carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear? Elena asked herself this question every night as she worked on the letter, knowing that her words might be the only thing standing between Marcus Wellington and a decision he couldn't take back. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when Elena was cleaning Marcus's home office. She had always been careful not to disturb his personal papers, but a gust of wind from an open window scattered several documents across the floor. As she gathered them up, one particular letterhead caught her eye: Memorial Sloan, Kettering Cancer Center. Elena's hands trembled as she carefully placed the papers back on his desk, but not before she glimpsed enough to understand. The pieces of the puzzle that had been forming in her mind suddenly clicked into place. Marcus's weight loss, which she had attributed to stress, his lack of appetite, which she had blamed on his workload, the way he sometimes paused in the middle of simple tasks, as if gathering strength for what came next. That night, Elena finished her letter. She wrote about Rosa Wellington, the woman in the photograph, whose obituary Elena had found in an old newspaper archive online. Marcus's grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. Rosa Wellington, who had worked as a maid her entire life, cleaning the homes of wealthy families to put her grandson through school. Rosa, who had died alone in a hospital while Marcus was building his empire, too busy with a crucial business deal to make it to her bedside in time. Elena wrote about forgiveness, not the kind that others give you, but the kind you must give yourself. She wrote about legacy, about the difference between what you accumulate and what you leave behind. She wrote about the children's hospital wing that bore Rosa Wellington's name, and how proud his grandmother would be of the man he had become, even in his darkest moments. But most importantly, Elena wrote about hope, about second chances and the courage it takes to choose life when death seems easier. She wrote about the people who would miss him, not just his business associates or the charities he supported, but the security guard in his building who always smiled when Marcus remembered to ask about his daughter, the barista at the coffee shop who had learned to have his order ready because Marcus was one of the few customers who always said, "Please and thank you." The morning Marcus was scheduled to leave for Singapore, Elena arrived at the penthouse earlier than usual. She had barely slept, the letter folded carefully in her apron pocket, like a prayer she wasn't sure she had the courage to deliver. Marcus was in his study, speaking quietly on the phone with someone about flight arrangements and meeting schedules. His suitcase sat by the front door, expensive leather that would travel to places Elena would never see. As she prepared his breakfast, Elena's hands shook slightly. She had spent her entire life being invisible, being the person who cleaned up after others' lives without ever inserting herself into their stories. But sometimes, she realized, love required you to step out of the shadows, even when it meant risking everything. When Marcus emerged from his study, he looked more tired than usual, as if the weight of his secrets was finally becoming too much to carry alone. He sat at the kitchen island, picking at his toast while scrolling through emails on his phone. The morning light coming through the windows seemed harsh, unforgiving, highlighting the sharp angles of his face and the dark circles under his eyes. "Elena," he said without looking up, "I want to thank you for everything you've done these past 3 years. You've made this place feel less empty." The words hung in the air between them, and Elena felt her heart break a little at the sadness in his voice. This was her moment, she realized. This was when the universe was asking her to speak. "Mr. Wellington," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." Marcus looked up, perhaps hearing something different in her tone. For the first time in months, he really saw her, not just as the woman who cleaned his home and prepared his meals, but as a person with her own story, her own wisdom, her own capacity for love. "I know about your grandmother," Elena continued, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her. "I know about Rosa Wellington, and I know about the hospital. I know about the letters from your doctors, and I know why you're really going to Singapore." Marcus's face went pale, and his phone clattered onto the granite countertop. "Elena, I don't know what you think you know, but..." I know you're planning to die alone, Elena said, the words coming out in a rush, just like you think your grandmother died alone. But you're wrong about that, Mr. Wellington. You're wrong about so many things. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her as if seeing a ghost, his carefully constructed walls crumbling in real time. Elena reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the letter, her hands no longer shaking. "And I wrote you something," she said, placing the envelope on the counter between them. "I know it's not my place, and I know you could fire me for this, but some things are more important than keeping your job." Marcus looked at the letter as if it might explode. "Elena, I can't—" "You don't have to read it now," she said gently. "But please, read it before you make any decisions you can't take back. Your grandmother didn't raise you to give up, Mr. Wellington. She raised you to fight." With that, Elena turned and walked toward the door, leaving Marcus alone with the letter and the weight of his own mortality. She didn't look back, didn't wait for his response, because she knew that some conversations could only happen between a person and their own conscience. Marcus sat frozen for nearly an hour after Elena left, staring at the envelope as if it contained either his salvation or his destruction. The letter was addressed simply, "For Marcus, with love and hope." The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the script of someone who had learned to write later in life, but who chose each letter with intention. Finally, with hands that trembled more than he cared to admit, Marcus opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Mr. Wellington," the letter began, "I have worked in your home for 3 years, and in that time I have watched you carry a burden that no person should carry alone. I have seen you build an empire while your heart broke a little more each day. I have watched you punish yourself for sins that exist only in your own mind, and I cannot stay silent any longer. And then I know about your grandmother, Rosa Wellington. I know that you believe you failed her, that you were too busy building your success to be there when she needed you most. But I also know something you have forgotten. Your grandmother was proud of you. She was proud of the man you became, proud of the empire you built, proud of the children's hospital that bears her name. I know this because I knew your grandmother, Mr. Wellington, not personally, but through the stories. You see, my own mother worked as a maid for 40 years, just like Rosa. She worked for families who never learned her name, who saw her as invisible, who forgot that she had dreams and hopes and a grandson she loved more than her own life. But your grandmother used to talk about you to the other women she worked with. She would show them newspaper clippings of your successes, pictures from magazines that featured your company. She would tell them about the little boy who used to help her fold laundry, who would sit at her kitchen table doing homework while she prepared dinner for families who had everything. She was not alone when she died, Mr. Wellington. She was surrounded by the love of the women who had become her family, the other maids and housekeepers who understood what it meant to sacrifice everything for the people you love. She spoke your name with her last breath, not in anger or disappointment, but in pride. Pure, unconditional pride. And I know about the doctors, about the diagnosis you received 3 months ago. I know about the treatment options you've refused, about the trip to Singapore that isn't really about business. I know because I've seen this before, in my own family, in my own community. I have seen good people give up when the fight seems too hard, when the guilt seems too heavy to bear. But I have also seen miracles, Mr. Wellington. I have seen people choose life when death seemed easier. I have seen love triumph over despair, hope overcome fear. I have seen what happens when someone finally understands that their life has value, not because of what they've accomplished, but because of who they are. You are not your failures, Mr. Wellington. You are not the moments when you fell short, or the times when you chose work over family. You are the man who quietly funds scholarships for children who look like you did at 12 years old. You are the person who remembers the names of every employee in your building, who asks about their families and their dreams. You are the grandson who built a hospital wing in honor of a woman who cleaned houses so you could change the world. Your grandmother's legacy is not her death, Mr. Wellington. Her legacy is you, the man you became because of her love, the lives you've touched because of her sacrifice, the hope you've given to others because she taught you that anything was possible. Please don't let her story end with your surrender. Please don't let the love she poured into you die with your despair. The world needs what you have to offer, not just your money or your success, but your heart, your compassion, your ability to see beyond the surface of things. Fight, Mr. Wellington. Fight for the little boy who used to help his grandmother with laundry. Fight for the children who will benefit from the scholarships you haven't created yet. Fight for the people like me, who see you as more than just another wealthy man in an expensive suit. Fight because your grandmother raised you to be a fighter, and she is watching from wherever love goes when it leaves this world. You are not alone, Mr. Wellington. You have never been alone. Love surrounds you, even when you can't see it, even when you can't feel it. Your grandmother's love, the love of the people whose lives you've touched, the love of those who see your heart beneath the armor you wear. Choose life, Mr. Wellington. Choose hope. Choose to honor your grandmother's memory, not by joining her too soon, but by living the life she dreamed for you when you were just a scared little boy who needed someone to believe in him. With all my love and respect, Elena Vasquez, P&S. Your grandmother would want you to know that the little boy she raised is still inside you, and he deserves a chance to see what tomorrow might bring. Marcus read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. By the 3rd reading, tears were streaming down his face, the first tears he had allowed himself to shed since his diagnosis 3 months ago. He thought about Rosa, about the woman who had worked her fingers to the bone so he could have opportunities she never dreamed of. He thought about the last conversation they'd had when she had told him how proud she was, how she knew he would change the world. He thought about the children's hospital wing that bore her name, about the scholarship fund he had established in her honor, about all the ways her love continued to ripple outward through his actions. He thought about Elena, this quiet woman who had seen through his carefully constructed facade and had loved him enough to risk everything to save his life. Slowly, Marcus reached for his phone and dialed a number he had been avoiding for weeks. "Dr. Morrison, this is Marcus Wellington. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the treatment options. I'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss moving forward." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Dr. Morrison explained the treatment protocol, the chances of success, the challenges that lay ahead. But for the first time in months, Marcus felt something other than despair. He felt hope, fragile and tentative, but real. When Eleanor arrived the next morning, she found Marcus in his study, but this time he wasn't staring at financial reports. He was looking at the photograph of his grandmother, really looking at it, as if seeing it for the first time. "Elena," he said when she knocked softly on the door, "thank you for the letter, for seeing what I couldn't see, for caring enough to risk everything." Elena smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep relief and deeper love. "Your grandmother raised a good man, Mr. Wellington. I just reminded you of what she already knew." "I called Dr. Morrison," Marcus continued. "I'm starting treatment next week. It's going to be difficult, and I'm going to need help." "You have help," Elena said simply. "You've always had help. You just forgot how to see it." Over the following months, as Marcus underwent treatment, Elena became more than just his housekeeper. She became his advocate, his companion, his reminder that healing required not just medical intervention, but human connection. She drove him to appointments when he was too weak to drive himself. She prepared meals that would help him maintain his strength. She sat with him during the long nights when fear threatened to overwhelm hope. But most importantly, she helped him reconnect with the parts of himself he had lost along the way. She encouraged him to reach out to old friends, to rebuild relationships that had been sacrificed on the altar of success. She helped him establish new programs at the Children's Hospital, initiatives that would directly involve him in the lives of the young patients. The treatment was brutal, as cancer treatment always is. There were days when Marcus questioned whether the fight was worth it, moments when the old despair crept back in. But Elena was always there, reminding him of his grandmother's love, of the lives that still needed touching, of the little boy inside him who deserved a chance to see tomorrow. 6 months after Elena had placed that letter on his kitchen counter, Marcus received news that would change everything once again. The treatment had worked. The cancer was in remission. He would need ongoing monitoring, continued treatment, but he was going to live. That evening, as they sat in his living room watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and amber, Marcus turned to Elena with tears in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You saved my life." Elena shook her head gently. "I didn't save your life, Mr. Wellington. I just reminded you that it was worth saving. Your grandmother did the real work a long time ago." "Call me Marcus," he said. "After everything we've been through, I think we can drop the formalities." Elena smiled. "Marcus, then, and you should know, your grandmother would be so proud of the man you've become. Not the businessman, not the billionaire, but the man who chose to fight when fighting seemed impossible." As the months turned into years, Marcus's life transformed in ways that had nothing to do with his bank account or his business empire. He became actively involved in the children's hospital, spending time with young patients who reminded him of himself at their age, scared, uncertain, but full of potential. He established mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs from backgrounds similar to his own. He learned to see his wealth not as a measure of his worth, but as a tool for creating the kind of change his grandmother had dreamed of. Elena remained in his life, but their relationship evolved beyond employer and employee. She became family, the sister he'd never had, the mother figure he'd lost too young, the friend who had seen him at his lowest point and had chosen to love him anyway. Her own children and grandchildren became part of his extended family, filling his home with the laughter and chaos he had never known he needed. On the 5th anniversary of his diagnosis, Marcus stood in the children's hospital wing that bore his grandmother's name, watching Eleanor read to a group of young patients. The children hung on her every word, just as he had hung on his grandmother's stories all those years ago. He thought about the letter that had changed everything, about the courage it had taken for a quiet woman to speak truth to power, about the love that had refused to let him surrender. Later that evening, as they walked through the hospital corridors, Marcus stopped at a plaque that had been installed near the entrance to the Rosa Wellington Children's Wing. It contained a quote from his grandmother, words Elena had helped him remember from one of their last conversations. "Love is not something you keep for yourself. Love is something you give away, and the more you give, the more you have." "She was right, you know," Marcus said, his voice soft with wonder. "About everything." Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "She usually was. That's what grandmothers do. They see the truth even when we can't." As they stood there together, surrounded by the evidence of love transformed into action, Marcus understood something that had eluded him for most of his adult life. Success wasn't measured in dollars or acquisitions or recognition. Success was measured in moments like this, in the lives touched, the hope restored, the love passed forward from one generation to the next. The little boy who had once helped his grandmother fold laundry had grown into a man who understood that the most important inheritance she had left him wasn't money or property or even the values she had instilled. It was the capacity to love and be loved, to see beyond the surface of things, to choose hope even in the darkest moments. Elena had reminded him of that capacity when he had forgotten it existed. She had seen the man his grandmother had raised, even when that man had lost sight of himself. She had written a letter that became a bridge between despair and hope, between isolation and connection, between a life half-lived and a life fully embraced. If this story has touched something in your heart, if you've ever felt lost in your own success or overwhelmed by your own struggles, remember that love has a way of finding us even in our darkest moments. Sometimes It comes in the form of a grandmother's sacrifice, sometimes in the courage of a friend who refuses to let us give up on ourselves. The rain that had hammered against Marcus's windows on that dark night months ago had given way to sunshine, but more importantly, the storm inside his heart had finally passed. He had learned what his grandmother had always known, that love, once given, never truly dies. It transforms, it grows, it finds new ways to heal the world, one letter, one choice, one act of courage at a time. In the end, Elena's letter had done more than save Marcus's life. It had reminded him that life, in all its messy, complicated, beautiful complexity, was always worth fighting for. And sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons or wealth, but with words written by someone who loves you enough to tell you the truth, even when that truth is hard to hear.